Welcome to this explainer. We're jumping right in today because we're going to dive into the sheer, unbelievable 60-year longevity of Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. Now, we all know the wild rock star legends, right? But we're going to look past all of that today to uncover the highly disciplined reality of their creative machine. We'll be using some fantastic insights from recent in-depth interviews with Mick Jagger himself to really understand how this legendary band has managed to survive and honestly thrive for so long. Okay, let's just tackle the elephant in the room right off the bat. Mick Jagger had this absolutely hilarious, totally self-deprecating quote during an appearance on David Letterman. He said, "You start out playing rock and roll so you can have sex and do drugs, but you end up doing drugs so you can still play rock and roll." It so perfectly captures the rock and roll mythos that has surrounded the Stones for decades. It's funny, it's iconic, and it's exactly what people expect. But to really get the reality behind that punchline, we've got to look at the staggering scale of their career. 60. That is the number of years they have been a defining force in music. Just let that sink in for a second. To stay at the absolute top of an industry that is literally famous for chewing people up and spitting them out in a matter of months. To do that for 6 entire decades requires something far beyond just partying. It requires an intense, almost unimaginable level of dedication. And honestly, their relentless drive is perfectly summed up by this next milestone: 25. They are actually releasing their 25th studio album, Hackney Diamonds. I mean, most bands are lucky to get to album number 3 before creative differences tear them apart. But the Stones, they're still getting into the studio, still writing, and still pushing themselves to put out new, original music well into their 80s. Just to cap off the pure spectacle of their history before we look under the hood, think about this number for a second: 300,000. That is the estimated number of fans who formed an absolute human tide at their historic 1969 Hyde Park concert in London. It was a massive cultural milestone, a huge free concert where Jagger famously wore a white dress on stage. It completely cemented them as the biggest rock band on the planet. Now here is where the juxtaposition gets really fascinating. While the whole myth is all about endless partying, chaos, and reckless abandon, the actual reality is that Mick Jagger, at 80 years old, trains every single day like an elite athlete. He's given up smoking, he's given up heavy drinking, and he treats being a frontman with incredibly strict discipline. Why? Basically, to protect his voice and maintain that staggering energy he brings to the stage. It's a bit boring compared to the myth, as he admits, but it is the absolute foundation of his survival. Section 1. From Chelsea to the World, the Stones' Evolution. You know, their rapid ascent was just staggering. Back in 1962, they were paying something like €15 a month for this chaotic, squalid little flat in Chelsea, London. By 1964, they were recording their first album in Regent Sound Studio. This was a tiny demo room so raw that the walls were literally lined with egg cartons just to deaden the acoustics. And then, boom, just 5 years later in 1969, they are playing to 300,000 people at Hyde Park. It was this explosive evolution from a tiny, messy apartment to global domination in less than a decade. So the real takeaway from that wild journey is the insane work ethic it birthed. It's highlighted perfectly by this stat. They have played their breakout hit, Satisfaction, a staggering 973 times live. That is the true reality of the job. It's not just about writing a hit. It's about showing up and delivering that hit with passion, night after night, decade after decade, nearly 1,000 times. Section 2. Collaborating on Hackney Diamonds. Now, despite their massive legacy, their new core album was recorded in under a month, and they brought in this wildly eclectic mix of collaborators. You've got Paul McCartney stepping into the studio to lay down some driving punk bass on a track, and apparently finishing his part in just 10 minutes. You've got pop superstar Bruno Mars, who just happened to be around, so they handed him a cowbell to play. And then you have Robert Smith of The Cure coming in to lend his signature synths and indie guitar licks. They aren't isolated in some rock star bubble. They are actively pulling in diverse talent to keep the sound fresh. It's so cool how their modern recording process is this perfect mashup of old school vibes and new tech. Despite all these massive star collaborations, the band still absolutely insists on capturing the magic by playing live together in a single room. They want that eye contact and that raw band energy. But they fully embrace modern technology too. Jagger actually mixed parts of the album remotely from the Caribbean, working live over fast internet with producer Andrew Watt, who was sitting in a studio all the way in LA. Which brings us to a really telling quote that reveals Jagger's ultimate philosophy for the record. He said, "It's gotta sound like it was recorded this year." I don't want it to be a retro thing. He completely rejects the idea of being a nostalgia act. He wants sonic clarity, he wants the fidelity to compete directly with the pop and rock music being released today. It's all about staying aggressively relevant, not just resting on their 1960s legacy. Moving on to Section 3, remembering Charlie Watts. Behind all the massive tours and the glitz, the true heart of the Stones has always been their brotherhood. Which really begs the question, how on earth does a band move forward after a 60-year partnership? It's hard to even fathom. Jagger had known Charlie Watts since he was 19 years old. You weren't just losing a bandmate at that point, you were losing a witness to your entire adult life. You see, what kept them so tight for 6 decades wasn't just the music. It was their deep, shared offstage passions. They bonded over post-war jazz, going to see legends like Cannonball Adderley together at the Apollo. They shared a huge love for collecting beautiful antiques and furniture, and they fiercely debated English football, with Charlie being a massive Tottenham fan and Mick supporting Arsenal. It was these normal, everyday passions that grounded their friendship amidst the absolute whirlwind of fame. And just to inject a little classic Charlie humor into his memory, Jagger fondly remembered one of his most frustrating but totally endearing quirks. Charlie lived out in the countryside in Devon, and he famously refused to have a phone. This meant that if Mick wanted to discuss something as crucial as $1 million stage design for an upcoming tour, he couldn't just call him up. He had to literally write him a letter or drive all the way out to Devon to see him in person. It's such a hilarious reminder of how stubbornly grounded Charlie remained. Section 4. Navigating fame and managing media scrutiny. To survive 60 years in the spotlight, Jagger had to set some serious boundaries. I mean, back in the 1970s, the media desperately wanted him to act as this political spokesman for his generation. They wanted him to analyze the sociological and political meaning of every single lyric. But Jagger's reality? He neutrally and firmly insisted he was just a regular musician. He said he reflected the youth, sure, but he had absolutely no interest in participating in politics or being the voice of a movement. He actively refused to carry that heavy, totally unrealistic burden. He really survives the public eye by strictly compartmentalizing. This quote is essential. Mick Jagger is a character in a film. It's not 24 hours a day. He firmly states that the Mick Jagger the world sees strutting around on stage is an exaggerated persona. Offstage, he insists he's just a normal guy. By separating the man from the myth, he protects his core self from being entirely consumed by the whole fame machine. Section 5. The legend looks forward. As we look at the drastically changing landscape of the music industry today, Jagger actually reveals a brilliantly forward-thinking mindset. It's so common for older musicians to romanticize the past, right? Like back in the 1960s, discovering music meant importing incredibly rare, super expensive blues and chess records from America. It was an exclusive club. But Jagger, he doesn't miss that at all. He actually loves the modern streaming era. He loves that a 16-year-old today can instantly access the entire history of recorded music with just a tap on their phone. He finds that access amazing, not detrimental. And honestly, it makes total sense when you consider what he's lived through. I mean, he's navigated the era of the 45 single, the rise of the Beatles-style pop album, the dominance of cassettes, the CD boom, and now the digital streaming age. His biggest takeaway from all this constant disruption: you simply must adapt and stay open-minded to survive. If you lock yourself into one era, you just become a museum piece. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If the Rolling Stones built an absolute 60-year global empire by listening to incredibly hard-to-find niche blues records, how is today's limitless, instant streaming access going to shape the sound, the work ethic, and the longevity of the next generational rock and roll machine? It's a pretty fascinating question. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this gave you a whole new appreciation for the absolute discipline behind the rock and roll myth.